Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are getting into Doomsday Clock. Thank God the newest issue of Doomsday Clock came out. I honestly didn't even know if it was gonna happen. Like, dude, this story has been so delayed, it's absolutely crazy. But it is really good, and it really is kind of worth it. It's pretty amazing. Like, we finally get answers here, right? Which is kind of the issue, right? Geoff Johns is great at writing, but sometimes he stretches things on a bit too long. Especially when it takes a story like 3 years to finish, then it's just like, all right, dude, just release it all as like a one shot. Like, just release the rest of it as like just one trade or something like that, just like one single story. Anyway, so what we have going on here in this world right now, in the DC universe, which remember, this is in continuity, this is taking place, I mean, before all the stuff that's going on right now, but basically it takes place in the main DC line of comics. You essentially have the world falling apart, right? Because the world has learned about the Superman conspiracy, or at least the Superman conspiracy has taken hold in the world. And then of course you had the explosion of Ronnie Raymond in Moscow, Russia, and then you had the superheroes taking off to Mars. So to get you guys caught up on, those of you guys who aren't really familiar with this, first things first, go watch all the other videos that we've done. And the second thing is to do kind of a rundown, like a quick little explanation here. The Superman conspiracy is this idea that floats around that after Superman arrived in the world, right? Like after he basically popped up and became Superman, he left Smallville, went to Metropolis and became Superman, that what the United States started doing was basically creating metahumans of their own that could either be a counter to Superman or could fight alongside Superman, right? It was basically the United States government's attempt to kind of maintain control of the country. Now, following that, you have the events in Moscow. And the idea behind this was that somewhere along the line, Ronnie Raymond and company ended up in Moscow, Russia. Now, how all that ties together, we'll actually find out later in the story. But basically, Ronnie Raymond ended up in Moscow, Russia, and during a major conflict, he essentially detonated. And when that happened, it basically killed a multitude of different people, essentially turning them to glass. And then people saw it as an attack by American metahumans on Russian soil. And so that basically led to Russians attempting to retaliate against the United States. Now, following this, you had all the superheroes, or at least all the major superheroes from the US who went to Mars. Now, they were following the trail of breadcrumbs, which led them to believe that Dr. Manhattan was on Mars, albeit they didn't know who he was. They just knew there was a being out there, and they had basically hypothesized that he was the one responsible for all of this. The problem was, when they went to go face off against Dr. Manhattan, he toyed with them for about 30 seconds and then took them all out. And that was basically it, right? So pretty much all the superheroes in the United States, except for Wonder Woman, Superman, and Batman, are basically gone. Like, I mean, they're not dead, but they're essentially unconscious on Mars. Now, because of that, what it does is it picks up with the fact that the Earth is basically devolved into total chaos, right? Like what you're seeing right now is essentially the way that Adrian Veidt's world in the Watchmen universe had essentially gone its way, right? I mean, Adrian Veidt basically released this giant monster into the world, and with all the death and all the destruction, it united humanity. And then following that, people eventually figured out that Adrian Veidt was the one behind it, that it was all one big ruse, and humanity actually devolved to a state worse than before. And then ultimately it ended with the Watchmen universe being engulfed in nuclear war, basically wiping out all life on Earth, or at least we can just kind of assume that was the case, since, you know, it was nuclear war. It was mutually assured destruction, right? It was mad. So because of that, this really kind of seems to be going the same way, right? Like things kind of seem to be devolving in the same process. You've got a litany of conflicts taking place, right? Like you've got Giganta facing off against Wonder Woman, and then suddenly she's met by the arrival of Black Adam. Now, this is when we end up finding out here that in Black Adam's country of Kahndaq, because of the fact that he's so isolationist, he's almost kind of taken this Magneto approach. Now, really, Black Adam has done this a litany of times over the years, right? Like, I mean, you really saw it a lot in the Injustice stories, but basically what Black Adam has done here is he has isolated Kahndaq and said, this is a safe haven for metahumans. All the metahumans who are left on Earth, who are not part of like the top tier superheroes, they can all come to Kahndaq and they can basically find like refuge. Now, it does allow the various metahumans to leave, but the big focus that the United States has at the moment, that is to say the American people and even people in Russia and in some other countries across the world, is that the United States needs to hand over Superman. And the reason why is because Vladimir Putin has issued a deadline, right? He said at midnight, if Superman is not handed over to the Russian government, we launch an attack. Because right now, the United States has no real superheroes, but Russia does. Russia has all their various superhero forces. And so invading the United States would actually go off pretty much without a hitch. And so again, like everything is kind of falling to pieces, because when all that happens, you end up having Superman, of course, who awakes, you know, following, you know, his incident and collapsing and all that kind of stuff. You've got Superman who basically wakes up into, you know, with this I guess, little break having been taken, with everything kind of going to pieces, with everything going to pot. And it's kind of a crazy scenario, because as that happens, you end up finding out that essentially that Adrian Veidt is talking to somebody that we can't really see, watching these things unfold and these makeshift monitors and everything sort of going to pieces, but then of course we end up finding out that Adrian Veidt is actually in Arkham Asylum. And the way this whole thing plays out, or at least it seems like he's in Arkham Asylum, but the way all this plays out is he walks by one room, tells this old man to be quiet, and then he basically ends up running up on Saturn Girl. Now remember, Saturn Girl was part of the Legion of Superheroes from the 30th century. I think Bendis changed it to the 31st century, but she's part of the Legion of Superheroes from the future, and she can read minds. The issue is that when she came back here, presumably she came back here to warn of like a major event that was going to happen, right? That's what Adrian Veidt says. Like, you came here to warn Superman of something that you couldn't possibly understand, right? But the issue is that somewhere along the line, she was basically captured, and she was thrown in Arkham Asylum at one point. We don't know exactly where she is right now, but like she was essentially captured and wasn't able to warn Superman. Now, because of that, we end up switching over to Lex Luthor. Now, this is one of the most important parts of the story, right? Because Lex Luthor has been working with Lois Lane to kind of give these little bits and pieces of information in terms of what seems to truly be going on here. And what Lex Luthor says is that at some point along the line that he found a photograph. Now, we know that this photograph is of John, right? It's of Dr. Manhattan back when he was human on the Watchmen universe. But this photo was brought with Dr. Manhattan over to the main DC universe when he arrived, and the picture was discovered. The issue with this is that multitudes of these pictures have been discovered, right? It'd be simple if it was just one, because what that means is that Dr. Manhattan brought the picture with him, and then when he showed up in the main DC universe at whatever time frame, then the picture was basically dropped, right? By accident or whatever the case may have been, he left it there, and that basically has kind of just been floating there ever since. The issue is that all these pictures are showing up here, right? They're showing up at different points in time in the DC universe. Now, really what Geoff Johns does is kind of give us a hint. He won't full on explain this until the end, but he kind of gives us a hint, right? Like the big moment is back on April 18th in 1938. Now, the reason why I say this is a hint is because for those of you guys who are familiar with your DC history, that's when Action Comics #1 was published. In the chronological timeline of DC, including all the various crises and everything they've had, that's when Clark Kent officially came out as Superman, right? Like that was his first major act as Superman. So that was a huge moment in the history of things. You go forward and you end up finding each one of these things has appeared at various points in time. Now, the question seemed to be, at least from Lois Lane's stance, does this mean that whoever's doing this is traveling through time? Now, those of you guys who are familiar with Dr. Manhattan know that's not the case. Dr. Manhattan does not time travel, right? He can't jump from the future to the past. Dr. Manhattan sees all time as a singular moment, right? So he's standing in 2019, right? And he's just kind of staring vaguely out into space. That's because he's seeing all points in time simultaneously. So he really kind of knows where things are going to be, but he doesn't actually go to the future. He still moves forward in time just like everybody else does, but he's not from this universe. So again, this is him popping up here. And so Lex Luthor actually has his own theory in terms of how it is that a man that cannot time travel somehow appears at different points in time with the same picture, right? Because by all standards of measurement, what this looks like is it looks like Dr. Manhattan showed up on April 13th in 1938 in the main DC universe when Superman first popped up, and then seemed to drop the picture or forget about it or whatever, and then left. Maybe went to a different universe or something like that, then came back. But it's almost like he basically went back to the past and then came to the future, and then went back to the past and then came to a different point in the future, and then rinse repeat, right? But we know that's not the case because Manhattan doesn't time travel. And so it's cool because we end up getting this really, really good explanation from Geoff Johns towards the end of this in terms of how all that goes down. And so really following this, you end up picking up with Reginald Long. Now, of course, again, Reginald Long was the son of Malcolm Long and the guy who's essentially the new Rorschach here. And while he's being held in prison, he starts experiencing these crazy visions, right? These visions of his father going in to basically speak with Walter Kovacs, that he's trying to plead with him, hey, look, don't do that. Don't be that guy who does that. It's only going to destroy you. End up meeting with Johnny Thunder. Now, of course, that happened at some point before, and Johnny Thunder basically sacrificed his life, right? He died. He just kind of burned alive. But then you basically end up seeing that he's actually speaking, or at least you kind of have this appearance of Alfred Pennyworth. Now, this is kind of a subtle thing, but it's also an exceedingly important thing. And the reason why is because it's very, very short and it doesn't seem to be important, but this basically solidifies the fact that Batman has not given up on Rorschach. Remember, Batman was the one that grabbed him, Batman was the one that took him and basically tossed him in the slammer, and he's kind of been there ever since. But what it means is that Batman didn't throw him in the slammer and then just walk away and forget about it. The Batman had a backup plan. The backup plan was, Alfred, do your homework. Go through here and look at everything about Reginald Long. Read the whole diary of Rorschach, the whole 9 yards. Learn everything you possibly can, given the circumstances, right? Because the guy's from a different universe, so he doesn't really have a life on this main DC universe. But learn everything you can and see if what he says is true. Of course, because Batman had everything else going on, didn't really have time for it. And that's what Alfred's been doing. Alfred's been doing research, he's been poking around, and he basically learned that everything that Reginald Long said is true, right? Everything that he's claimed about his life, about Rorschach, the man, Walter Kovacs being Rorschach before him, that all of that is true. He's not just a crazy guy. But the issue is that where you end up having Alfred Pennyworth trying to side with him, all that you really have, or at least all that Reggie really knows at this point, is betrayal, right? That's really all he knows about his life, is betrayal. Losing his father, Ozymandias turning against him, Batman throwing him in the slammer. That's all he really knows. And so of course he ends up bailing on Alfred Pennyworth and taking off, and that's when things really sort of just kind of vanish. And because what this does is it switches over to the answer, to an answer to the question that a lot of people have been wondering about Doomsday Clock. Since the beginning of Doomsday Clock, one of the questions a lot of people have had is, where's Sally Jaspezek, whatever her name is, like Sally Jupiter basically, and like Night Owl 2? Where are those characters at? And we actually get an answer here. So if you recall the characters from the previous video, Marionette and Mime, who were basically just criminals, right? They were just street level criminals that at some point in their past, when they were committing a robbery, that Dr. Manhattan was going to kill them, but then chose not to because of the fact that Marionette was pregnant. Now, what Ozymandias says here is that when this went down, everybody believed that Dr. Manhattan didn't kill Marionette because of the fact that she was pregnant. But then he started thinking, literally, Dr. Manhattan stood there and watched the comedian kill a pregnant woman. So like, he doesn't really care about the notion of pregnancy, like the significance of it or anything like that. It's just a human he doesn't really care anything about, who was also housing a smaller human who he doesn't really care anything about. So the question was, why did he save Marionette? And the reason why is because at some point along the line, Marionette would give birth to their daughter, and then either they would die or they would end up in jail, or she would have to give it up, or whatever the case is, but the child would be handed over to Sally Jaspezek and to Dan Dryberg, who have basically adopted the monikers of Hollis. Now, that was a very end of the Watchmen, that was part of the Watchmen story, but essentially like they adopted new identities and then went forward as wholly new people. Now, the downside of this is we can largely assume that they basically died in the Watchmen universe, right? When the world was engulfed in nuclear war, that was basically the end of it. But that's what ends up happening here with Ozymandias, is he basically starts to break down all this bit of a story, starts to explain all these different things. And what he says here is that on his world, that it all basically engulfed. He was trying to find a way to unite it, right? And then he was trying to find a way to save his world. Once everybody realized that he was basically pulling a ruse, that he's the one who released the monster, that humanity didn't actually unite itself because of some genuine threat from a different dimension or from outer space or however they wanted to interpret it. Instead, like they were all manipulated by Ozymandias. And so as a result of this, what he wanted to do was basically save his world, which was rapidly devolving in a nuclear war, which we can largely assume by now is it's already too late for it. And at the same time, like try to find a way to save this world, which would ultimately end up devolving into the same landscape. And so what he did is he manipulated this world in order to save it. That when he went out and when he started poking around and he started looking around, what he ended up discovering is that one, when he grabbed this ship and when he stowed away and then he jumped from his universe to this universe, that as he started going around and looking around, he discovered, of course, superheroes. He discovered like the Flash and Wonder Woman and Batman and Shazam and all these characters, which seemed exceedingly impossible, right? I mean, it is a different universe from his own. And so if DC Comics can have a universe where anthropomorphic animals, including Captain Carrot, I love Captain Carrot. Captain Carrot's a super bunny. If you can have a universe that basically has anthropomorphic animals playing the role of superheroes, then you can have a universe where you have humans who are superheroes, right? Like an infinite number of universes for an infinite number of possibilities, which seemingly only 52 have actually been discovered according to Grant Morrison's Multiversity. And so because of that, what he did is he said, okay, fine, there's a way to manipulate everything. There's a way to basically get Manhattan to come back. And so what he did here is seemingly in the blink of an eye, he engineered this plan that when he started looking around, he learned that the Superman conspiracy actually had merit. That while it wasn't like not every single metahuman in the United States is a result of government experimentation, some of them are. Under Martin Stein, basically the guy who would go on to merge with Ronnie Raymond and become Firestorm, that under Martin Stein, all these projects were seen, they were overseen, and they were basically designed to create metahumans that could either counter Superman or fight along and monitor Superman, right? It was basically the US government never fully trusted the Man of Steel. And so they wanted to have at least some kind of deterrent, right? As Superman was basically a really, really cool guy. And then Lois Lane broke his heart and he said, you know what? The heck with humanity, right? Like he followed the red pill and just became this really angry guy and then basically like tried to wipe away the world. Then they would have a way to counter that, right? And so because of that, what he did is he said, okay, then let's take this Superman conspiracy and let's leak it to a guy named Pozar out in Russia, right? So then Russia gets a hold of the Superman conspiracy before the US does, and then Russia starts espousing it. And so that's why you ended up having this initial rift in the United States, because Russia was saying that the United States is creating all these various superheroes in response to Superman, that the Superman conspiracy is real, and the American people initially rejected it, right? Well, this is just Russians using misinformation and just doing what they do. But then detailed information started to leak out. And as that information started to leak out, humanity began to believe it. And as they started to believe it, they started to turn against Superman. Following this, Ozymandias engineered the explosion of Firestorm in Russia, which further seemed to lead to the idea that if the United States government is engineering superheroes for the purpose of doing whatever it is that they want to do, and then Russia called them on it, Russia leaked that information, this is the US government retaliating against Russia, or it's the superheroes retaliating against Russia. Whatever the case is, it looks like it's the United States acting in a defensive manner because what Russia said was true. And so it further solidified the Superman conspiracy and then further solidified people turning against Superman and the various members of the superhero community. And so when all this is basically explained, we end up having this really, really cool exchange that takes place between one, Superman and Black Adam, as well as Ozymandias and Jupiter Girl. Not Jupiter Girl, Saturn Girl. Against Mars Girl. So the way this plays out, of course, is you basically have like Black Adam and his forces would show up on the White House lawn, right? Which never bodes well. Like anytime that Black Adam shows up, it usually means somebody's gonna get the crap beat out of him, right? It's usually the way it is. So you end up having this kind of exchange here, right? Now, Superman shows up because regardless of what the world thinks of him, Superman will continue to protect the world. Now, that's the nature of his character. It's the way he's always been written. That Superman's role, his loyalty is not to like a singular government. Superman is not loyal to the US government any more so than he would be loyal to the Russian government or anything like that. If it's something that would endanger people, like he'll side with the government if they need him to do something that would basically like stop some catastrophic threat, right? Like the US government comes to him and says, Superman, there is a meteor coming to Earth and it's going to destroy all life on Earth. We need you to work alongside the Suicide Squad and stop it. Okay, then like he would do that. But like he's not a government stooge. This is not like the Dark Knight Returns where he just does what the government tells him to. Instead, it's basically one of these things where he's an ally of Earth. And having like Black Adam show up on the White House lawn to confront the president is basically a scenario that goes with Superman saying somebody has to act. But this is the problem with the Superman conspiracy, right? You know, in this day and age, it's, you know, people choose the facts they want, right? Like people believe what they want to believe. And so because of that, people would look at that and they would say, well, it's not really Superman standing and like protecting the president. It's Superman protecting the government because he's a government stooge because of the Superman conspiracy, because, you know, I believe it's true. I want it to be true. So I'm going to assume it's true. And it's interesting. It's really kind of a social critique, right? It's a critique on modern society, right? Like people replace facts with their opinions and then treat their opinions as fact. And so it's kind of interesting, you know, in terms of how this unfolds. But you end up having Ozymandias who basically asks this question to Saturn Girl. He says, here's the question that I have for you. If you come from the future of this timeline, and in the future of this timeline, a massive event takes place and you've come to warn Superman because of it, here's my question. Does Superman remember you, right? Like, does he like in whatever this future is, does Superman remember you? And the response to that question is no. And so basically she starts to vaporize because what Ozymandias basically says is you come from a timeline that doesn't exist anymore, right? You come from a timeline that's not there anymore. This feeds into what Dr. Manhattan had basically discovered is that by virtue of his actions, the Legion of Superheroes don't exist, right? The Legion of Superheroes cease to exist because of something that it is that he's done. And so as you end up having Ozymandias passing by this cell with this old man, we end up learning this old man is actually Alan Scott. He's the Green Lantern, which is a crazy revelation. That seemingly Alan Scott seems to be still alive. Like I don't really know how. As far as I'm aware, he's dead. That what ended up happening is in one of the earlier Doomsday Clock stories, that Dr. Manhattan had actually moved the lantern away from Alan Scott so that when the lantern landed, Alan Scott didn't see it and was hit by the train. Instead of in the original comic, when he saw the lantern crash and then he went to go grab the lantern, and because he grabbed it, he wasn't hit by the train, right? He missed the train. And so because of that, like it's kind of a crazy little facet here, because you end up having Manhattan watching this whole scenario unfold with Superman fighting against Black Adam. And he says, like, in 6 seconds, Superman is going to see me. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Superman meets Dr. Manhattan. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.